Could talk for an hour. Hello, David Fuentes, Hidalgo County Commissioner, Precinct 1.
And David, we're here at your office here in Weslaco today to discuss water issues. I think it's fair, and drainage issues. I think it's fair to say this has been your number one issue because of the topography of the Mid-Valley, I guess. But tell us if that's the case. It's always been the most pressing issue, and tell us all about the work you've done over the years and what's still to do.
So I'll go back to 2017 when we first came into office, and right around that time, Hurricane Harvey was coming. It was actually headed right to the valley. Some of my staff and I were at a legislative session up in Austin. As soon as we checked into the hotel, we got up to our rooms and we went. We started having a little meeting because this hurricane was tracking to hit directly on us. We made the decision to basically pack our bags and come straight back home. We got here just to see that the hurricane turned north and headed right at Houston. And thankfully, with all the damage that occurred, that would have been really catastrophic to our area. But it really highlighted the vulnerability of our area to storms, especially hurricanes. So at that point in time, we started advocating for different types of monies and funds, grants, anything that would help us be more prepared for an event. And a lot of what we would say at the state capitol, and anybody that would listen to us, was that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that might be cliche, but at the same time, we knew and know. You go back to Hurricane Beulah, Hurricane Allen, and all the other hurricanes that have been that have hit the valley. They've been devastating to homeowners, to property owners, to business owners. So it was an important thing for us to consider. So we were out there, just saying that we need attention, we need more resources, we need to find the funds to be able to put projects into the ground. Needless to say, about 7 to 8 months later, we get hit with this rain event in June of 2018. It actually highlighted, exactly how unprepared our system was to handle that level of water and the storm inundation that was happening because of how fast it was falling, and that it was nonstop. The rate at which it was falling was also very hard to manage because it was coming down extremely hard for quite some time. We thought we were out of it 24 hours later. That didn't seem to be the case because it started raining on the western part of the county. Mission and all of that area started to get the same type of rainfall that we got on the east and in Cameron County. That highlighted a different situation that we needed to address. So first, we needed better systems to be able to manage rainwater that actually directly hit us. Second was that head wall of water that was coming from the west 24 hours later, because of the rainfall that happened further upstream, started to rise levels even further than what they were already in our system, and it started to create a pushback into neighborhoods. So as that water level was rising, it started pushing water back into our neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that weren't flooded, we found that 2 days after the rain event started to flood. And so it showed that we were vulnerable in two different ways. One, the capacity of our system. Second, that our system needed to be fortified with other things to try to keep that pushback from happening. So that's when we really started to push. When I say thankfully, I mean that in a political way, in the sense that disaster recovery money became available. When we declare disaster at the state level, at the federal level, then state and federal resources start to become available. The Housing and Urban Development starts to put out, relief packages, competitive bids through the state administration, where they can help people get back to normal. So it's kind of like FEMA, but for public entities. So we started researching exactly what would qualify and how we could qualify. And even then, when we started looking at that, we're trying to see if we would be able to tap into Harvey resources, because a lot of the way that the language was on some of those disaster recovery and mitigation, because recovery is after you've already sustained the damage. Mitigation is more of a planning for future events. So for us, we were looking at Harvey to see if there was some mitigation components to it as far as funding so that we could create some projects. And then once we got the disaster declarations, of course, we have to wait through time. But at the drainage district level, we started saying, okay, we need to go out for a bond. There's so much need. There were some prior studies that were done at the Council of Governments through the COG that had identified roughly $2 billion of drainage improvements that needed to be made in order to really get to a point where we were gonna be in a much better place. It's hard to find $2 billion. So our approach was just like, okay, we're just gonna start chipping away at this and see what we can do. So we started to, we pressed the Drainage District and Commissioners Court to consider going out for a 2018 bond. We checked to see, what we could capture and what kind of impact that would make to the tax rate. We developed the most critical projects that we felt precinct-wise absolutely had to be made without question. There were other studies that we kind of contemplated or we looked at in the past that highlighted some colonia deficiencies with respect to drainage, and we used those resources as a starting point as to where we would start with our most vulnerable population in places that didn't have any drainage at all. So we started looking at that and compiling all of that information. And from that, we came up with the $188 million bond referendum that we put out in 2018. A lot of people suffered and knew that the improvements that we were going to make were going to be beneficial to them. We had the support of the community passed overwhelmingly. I believe it was like 80-20. So that was very positive for us. We started to get to work right away. Have some project listings and maps up here that show the projects and where they're located in my precinct. Sadly, in 2019, went through a very similar event. It's like 1 year and a day later. We went through a similar type event. Again, all of our projects were not in the ground yet. We had similar type of catastrophic flooding. And then fast forward to 2020, not only did we get hit with a freeze in February, we had COVID and the shutdown in March, and then we had Hurricane Hannah in July. So it was just back to back. We had those 5 events were all disasters that, made us respond in a way. So this has been an important part of what we do, and that's kind of the history of why drainage became so important in this area, because it really highlighted that there was a tremendous amount of need and a lot of where we hadn't done enough to really prepare ourselves. We have a lot of agricultural ditches that are really designed more for farm and agricultural runoff. They're not designed for surface runoff at all, and the amount of construction and expansion and development that's occurred really has increased that level of need. So that's why we've been really focusing a lot on what we're doing here.
Going back to, I think it would have been the first big flood event that you mentioned. To this day, this is still our most watched video. You may have seen it at the time. A very irate resident from Weslaco comes out of the town hall, City Hall. They had a town hall meeting about the flooding, and he was so passionate or angry, whichever way you want to describe it. And he was just letting rip at the council for the way they allowed this to happen, but half of it in Spanish, half in English. And to this day, I don't think we've had a video that people have watched more. It really sort of got a lot of hits on social media. I just wonder if you happen to remember that guy, and did he get his house fixed? It was flooded badly.
So I can't speak specifically about maybe something different. What I remember is at the county, we organized a press conference that was held in the city chambers a few days after the event, maybe about a week later.
That could have been it.
And we had probably 20 to 30 people that came up and spoke. And the very first one was a very passionate man about his experience, and that we should have been more prepared and such. People had a right to be angry, that there hadn't been a focus on infrastructure for quite some time. While I appreciate that is a sensitive issue, I had been in office for roughly a year and a half, and to me it really highlighted the need of what we're talking about, which is those drainage improvements. But I understand. I mean, if I had lost my home, I would be pretty upset about it as well. So it's hard to it's hard to be critical of people that maybe lost their investment in their homes, whether they had insurance or they have to rely on FEMA. We all handle things differently, but I understand. But it certainly made us really zero in and focus on what was most important at that time. The press conference was really to provide information about what we were doing to respond and what county resources were going to be made available to people. Whether it was food, whether it was cleaning supplies, whether it was food giveaways, what our emergency management was going to do next, how we were going to engage FEMA to come down and start doing assessments, not just for public assistance, which affects the governmental entity, but also individual assistance, which impacts individual homeowners that maybe not have had flood insurance at the time. So we were just trying to pass along information, and some residents used it as a platform to really vocalize their anger and frustration and what seemed to be obvious after the fact.
So you go to Austin a lot to make the case for more funding for our region and more resources. In all those discussions with county commissioners from around the state, really, is there anything like Precinct 1 anywhere else? It just seems as though, again, because of the topography of the lay of the land here, that you've got the biggest challenge. I mean, is that fair to say in all your discussions up there in other parts of Texas?
So I think that what's important is that we've always, since my time in office, I've worked with my fellow county commissioners in Cameron County and Willacy County, and we all are going through similar experiences. Cameron County floods just as much as we do. So I would never say that we've got it worse than anybody else. The other thing I will say is that when we were looking at, we were working with Dade Phelan, Speaker of the House, who was really pushing hard for the flood infrastructure funding program that came into effect about 4 years ago, and he experienced very similar type issues. And when we were putting that in front of the voters, one of the things that came out was that out of the 254 counties in Texas, 100 of them had a disaster declaration due to flooding. So it's not something just specific to coastal counties. It really impacts more than half of Texas when you start looking at disaster declarations due to flooding, because rivers overflow whenever there's a lot of rainfall in some of the ranch countries and sometimes in the hill country as well. San Antonio experiences that kind of stuff. You wouldn't think that, being so far away from the coast, that they would have those kinds of situations, but they do. Actually, I lost a former coworker of mine because she was swept off in a car because of rising waters from a river, and she ended up passing away. So it happens throughout the state of Texas. It is devastating to us here in the eastern part of Hidalgo County, because from our point to the outfall at the Laguna Madre, it's only a 60-foot drop in elevation, and it's roughly a 60-mile space in between, my part of the county and the outfall. So you're looking at a gravitational pull of 1 foot per mile, and that's just not going to move a lot of water. Where you look at the western side of the county, and there's roughly a 300-foot elevation drop in about 45 miles. So water pushes pretty quick out of the western part of even Hidalgo County by itself, but from here to the Laguna Madre, us, Willacy County, and Cameron County all face very similar challenges.
Going back to that Council of Government report that you highlighted a moment ago, $2 billion was the need assessment. Can you remember what year that was? Because surely the figure must be higher now with inflation and more of the agricultural land being eaten up by development. I mean, who knows what the figure would be today? Right.
So I believe that the engineer of record was Half Associates, and they specifically focused on colonias, and it was a colonia study to see where infrastructure was lacking and where it wasn't sufficient. And I want to say that report was finalized when I came into office, so it probably was, the study was done probably in 2015, 2016.
But if they did it all again, what would the figure be?
Yeah, so the figure would be, probably because of inflation and the way prices have risen, it would probably be about the same, because you would have to back out the improvements that we've already made. And just in Hidalgo County alone, from the 188 million back in 2018 and then the 195 million that we did in 2023, by the time you factor those things in, you're looking at $390 million of improvements that have been bond approved. In addition to that, we received $20 million from the General Land Office to make ditch improvements along the main drain. We got a $10 million grant on one of our flood infrastructure funding projects. So we've offset $30 million of improvements with state and federal funding that came to us. So it's more than $400 million that we're putting into the ground actively. And I know that with the cities, City of Edinburgh, City of Weslaco, City of FAR, they've issued their own bonds to do projects themselves. So when you start putting all of that in, maybe we've reached, with Cameron County included, maybe $500 million. So when you factor in what the needs were at a $2 billion effort, back out the the $500 million we've already done. Yeah, I mean, we're still well over $1.5 billion of needs, and we're continuing to advocate for that. We still work together as a group. We still go up to, you mentioned going up to Austin, but we actually went up to DC quite a bit because a lot of the funding that the state receives is from federal divisions. So we wanted to make sure that our case was represented, that the situations that we're facing here, we weren't a hurricane, so we didn't qualify like a major hurricane event when you get all this news coverage and the media really promotes like how devastating a hurricane event was. This was just rain. This was just a very heavy rainfall. So we had to go out there and actually talk about how devastating this rain event really was, and the kinds of the impact that it had on our residents here. And when you have a neighborhood of 500 homes that had over 350 homes that had water intrusion into their houses, that's one neighborhood in a very large county. So
I was going to ask, that was going to be my next question. With all these improvements you've made, have you noticed, do the residents acknowledge, do they know that the work's been put in and they can see an improvement?
I hope so.
In general?
I hope so. I think in general we do see that when you hear a complaint, it's because there's a valid concern. When you don't hear the complaint, maybe things are working the way they're supposed to. So in that 2018 event, when we had over 300 homes that had water intrusion in that neighborhood, in 2020 with Hurricane Hannah, after not even all of the improvements had been made, but some of the improvements had been made, we had less than 5 homes with water intrusion during a hurricane, during that kind of a rain event. So we went from over 300 to 5. That's a significant change and an impactful change with respect to what we designed, what we had figured out actually worked and was making a difference.